We're live. Good morning.
Good morning, all. What a beautiful day it is. What is it? Thursday, the 23rd. Here in, I'm in America. We got Alison, Dave, and Anita, who wrote this great, amazing book on why vegans have smaller brains. And want to welcome all of you for being here this morning, this afternoon, because I think it's a little later for you.
It's still morning.
Yeah. And we're going to be talking about why vegans have smaller brains. And I guess my first question is it true?
The studies show that if you follow a vegan diet for a certain amount of time, your brain, in older people, your brain shrinks more quickly than it does in people who aren't following a vegan diet. But most importantly, it studies on babies who've been breastfed by vegan or vegetarian mothers who show severe atrophy sometimes. And this atrophy can be reversed by giving them treatment with vitamin B12. And if it's picked up in time, the atrophy actually reverses completely. So the studies on older people are observational type studies linking B12 to brain atrophy. But in babies, it's being breastfed by vegan or vegetarian mothers that show brain atrophy.
We're talking today with David Ellis, Alison Morgan, and Anita Tagore on their book, Why Vegans Have Smaller Brains, and how cows reverse climate change, which I think is amazing. And can you tell us why you wrote this book? What inspired you to do this?
Well, we didn't want to write just a book on diet or just a book on farming. We wanted to show how diet, health, farming, and the environment are all interconnected. As it so happens, the diet that we're proposing, if farmed correctly, is actually good for the environment. So it's a win-win. Ali wrote the farming section of the book, so she knows a lot about that.
And when we're talking about farming, I mean, obviously there's the agricultural part of plant development, and then there's the husbandry of animal products. Should we be afraid of eating animals? And is it truly our natural diet by focusing on animals?
In terms of the environment and being afraid of eating animals, as we discuss in the book, we shouldn't be afraid of eating animals. Animal farming can be very beneficial for the environment. And we also describe that, in fact, the number of deaths that it causes of animals is far less than the deaths caused by arable farming for plant-based foods. So obviously cows come in for a lot of criticism. They are ruminants. They belch out methane as part of their digestive metabolism. And so methane is, regarded as a global warming gas. But as we talk about in the book, that methane is just part of a biogenic carbon cycle. And in fact, when you rear cattle or sheep or any other ruminants at grass, at pasture, they are contributing not only to not adding carbon to the atmosphere, they are also contributing to a natural system, which actually draws down carbon from the atmosphere via plants in photosynthesis, and it gets stored in the soil. So they actually build up soil carbon and reduce atmospheric carbon. So the idea that methane from cattle or other ruminants is harmful is just incorrect.
Why is there so much propaganda against the cows and pro plant-based diet for us humans?
Yeah, that's a good question. Every time you look at the media, they focus, as Alice just described, on methane in cows, but they don't explain anything else about the entire system, the biogenic carbon cycle. So I don't know if it's laziness on the part of the journalism. I mean, Gary Taubes explores this a lot in his Substacks as to the quality of journalism in this space. And it's also true of the quality of the journalism on diet. It just seems to be so
biased,
so ingrained that plants are green and must be healthy. And all these stories you hear about meat being bad for you, or eggs being bad for you, or fat being bad for you, is just a complete misunderstanding of what's really going on.
Some of the basis of the claims for livestock farming contributing to climate change do come from UN organisations like the Food and Agriculture Organization. They say that that the livestock sector globally contributes. Their latest figure is 12% of greenhouse gases. But the problem is that there is no comparable assessment of the crop sector, the plant-based sector. So if we're not going to eat animal foods, what are we going to eat? Because the assessments, the various studies that you can find, they don't include all the emissions from crop agriculture. So some of the emissions tend to be allocated to the energy sector. Some of them tend to be allocated to the transport sector. And in fact, if you look at, for instance, the UK government data on emissions from agriculture, and also the US government emissions data, indicates that total emissions from agriculture are around about 9 or 10% of the national emissions, and that's roughly half and half crops and livestock. But what they don't take into account is that there are different systems of livestock production. So there's intensive livestock production, grain-fed, housed livestock like pigs and poultry, and there's pasture-reared ruminants. And actually, the pasture-reared ruminants are really good for the environment. And also, they, as I've explained, they sequester carbon into the soil, so that carbon sequestration simply isn't accounted for in the IPCC and FAO data.
Doesn't there seem to be an agenda to blame the animals for a problem, and yet we've forgotten about the human industrialization of the world as the real cause of damage to this world?
Yeah. Do you want to take that, Dave, or
you go on, Ali?
Industrialization, yeah. Obviously, farming we've only been farming for about 10,000 years or so. And that led to settled communities rather than sort of moving nomadic communities following our natural evolutionary diet of hunting and eating large herbivores and eating a lot of fat. And so when we transitioned to agriculture, that led to what we call civilization and city development, and that has had all sorts of negative ramifications, as we know. And one of the things about industrialization is our industrialized agriculture, and it's mainly plant-based agriculture that is industrialized. So we are in arable agriculture. We're using a lot of fossil fuels in field operations with big machinery. So a lot of CO2 emissions, which generally aren't accounted for in any assessments that are made. And one of the main factors is that plant-based agriculture, arable agriculture, in the way that we do it now over the last 100 years or 80 to 100 years, it's separated from livestock farming and grassland agriculture. And so with arable crops, they are annual plants that have to be sown every year. And so you have to prepare the soil, plough the soil or till it in some way and prepare a seed bed. And there's huge continuous soil disturbance, which leads to the exposure of the organic matter in the soil to the air. That organic matter contains the carbon in the soil. And that just gets oxidized by the air, and we get huge carbon dioxide emissions. In fact, one of the things that rarely gets, that people rarely hear, is that around about a third of the carbon dioxide that's been added to the atmosphere through human activities has come from this soil degradation, and most of that from arable agriculture. We used to get around that in the past, historically. 100 years ago, farming in Britain and most systems of farming were mixed farming systems, where you would grow a year or two of wheat and barley or vegetables, and then you would follow it with a grass lay, 1 to 5 years, and cattle and sheep on it, because farmers and everyone understood historically that arable farming depletes the soil, degrades the soil, and takes nutrients out of the soil, and it also eradicates the natural habitat and wildlife. But grassland farming and grazing livestock restore the soil and also are good for biodiversity. We just lost that from our community memory, and it's been just sort of whitewashed.
And what we've done as well is
too. Sorry, Dave. I was just going to say, anyone that chooses organic farming, that's what organic farming is. It's we're putting organic matter back into the ground, and it's mainly livestock manure and grass that do that.
And what we've done in separating, in removing animals from the arable system, is what have we replaced them with? And part of this industrialization that we've seen over the last 50 to 100 years has been the use of agrochemicals. So we're forced to use artificial means to maintain the ability to grow crops. And agrochemicals themselves come at a huge carbon footprint in their manufacture. And that's, I think, another thing that isn't taken into account of in the figures when people say that arable farming is not contributing to global warming. Yes, it is.
Isn't it our drive, and maybe you could talk a little bit about this, for higher and higher production of products and profits, rather than accepting and realizing that it's that drive which is damaging our world more than anything, and our ancient way of hunting and gathering, and maybe we have some sort of dreamlike imagination of what it really was like. I mean, hunting and killing an animal is hard, but growing a plant is easy. Is it our quest for profits and ease that is really the biggest detriment to our world?
I would say that actually it's not as easy as we believe, but we're trapped in the system now. So there's good evidence that hunter-gatherer communities in the past, hunting communities in the past, and in the present actually have more leisure time, because they can obtain far more nutrition and energy from eating meat and fatty meat than we can gain from eating arable crops and vegetables and so on. And actually, arable farming is very hard work, and hence our civilization has developed into this very hierarchical civilization with the lower classes working hugely long hours on the land or in other ways, So in terms of the development of this industrialized agriculture system as well, it hasn't been, the priority has not been human health and welfare and well-being. In fact, we're in agriculture, in plant breeding, we're always aiming for higher yields and things that will make it easier for the production of lots of grain or whatever the crop is, things that are more resistant to pests. There is no focus, generally there is no focus on the nutritional content of the plant and its goodness in terms of human nutrition. And in fact, we've often concentrated harmful things like gluten in those crops as we've bred them.
Some people question how much of our diet pre-agriculture was animal-based and how much was plant-based. So if you look at the return on investment, as you might say, of acquiring different types of food, the one that gives the most return on calories and nutrition is actually large herbivores, and then it's small game and fish, and then it's plant foods. So pre-agriculturally, man would have focused on obtaining animal-based foods.
And it has the least amount of toxins. And maybe you could talk a little bit about how plant toxins and maybe plant fiber may be harmful for us rather than good for us.
So the plant foods that we eat now have all been bred to be less fibrous and more palatable than plants used to be. It's a big difference already. And the other issue with plant foods is that the bioavailability, that's how easily you absorb nutrients from plant foods, is very low. So even though, for example, on a packet of carrots, it might say it contains vitamin A. For a start, it doesn't contain any vitamin A. It contains beta-carotene. And then that beta-carotene, how much of it you absorb depends on how the carrot is eaten. If it's raw, it's about 11%. If you cook it with fat, it's a bit higher. And then there's the issue of converting the beta-carotene to vitamin A in the human body. And about half the population, their genetics renders that conversion inefficient. So there's anti-nutrients which slow down the absorption of nutrients in plant foods, and many people don't appreciate that.
And it never gets reported, which is one of the reasons they don't get to understand this. In the UK, the National Food Guidelines are labelled as Eat Well, and it's called the Eat Well plate, and it shows you a plate of imaginary food, and it divides it into sectors. And the majority of it is meant to be plant-based. And it's there's stuff like 5 a day, eat 5 a day of different coloured fruit and vegetables. Actually, it's interesting, when you go into the website, the advice isn't 5 a day. The advice is at least 5 a day, which could be 7 a day, 10 a day. And the way I like to think of it is, for an adult, if you were aiming to eat, say 7, that's 50 portions a week. And for a family of 4, say, 2 adults, 2 medium-sized children, that's 150 portions of fruit and veg that the guidelines are saying they should be eating every week. It strikes me that something that you have to eat 150 times a week can't be a very good source of nutrition. And it's a case of quantity rather than quality, trying to make up for the fact that either the vitamins aren't there at all, or they're not bioavailable, such as beta-carotene, or that the plants contain antivitamins that inhibit absorption.
And the thing about fiber is that it's not even a nutrient. We don't need it. There are just many myths about fiber and colon cancer, fiber and constipation. There was a really good study done at the University of Singapore, which showed that removing all fiber from your diet actually eases constipation and bloating. We don't need fiber at all.
Dr. Kiltz, I have a question. It's kind of a funny question. But what is actually the problem with having a smaller brain? Like a child, vegan or vegetarian mom breastfeeds their baby, the baby has a smaller brain. What developmental issues occur if they have a smaller brain? Like, I'm curious if people are going to fight that. That's not a problem. You know, they see having a smaller brain is not a problem. Like, what are the actual problems with that?
So if you have severe brain atrophy, as in the babies who've been breastfed by vegan mothers, if it's not corrected in time, they develop severe mental problems. And in older people, it's the rate of atrophy that matters. We all get some atrophy as we age. It starts in our mid-20s. It's about 1% a year. And from our 50s onwards, it's about 2% a year. It's the rate of atrophy that matters, and having lower amounts of B12 in your diet as you get older increases the rate. And the rate at which your brain atrophies also is a risk for developing cognitive impairment and dementia. Those with the greatest degrees of brain atrophy are more likely to be cognitively impaired or suffer or suffer dementia.
And in infants and young children, the consequence of that lack of B12 and the impact that has on the brain is that they will not reach their full cognitive potential later in life.
Yes, so you have to get the right nutrients as a child within the first 2 years. And if you don't, you don't fulfill your cognitive potential.
And it's irreversible after if it hasn't.
I mean, there's loads of evidence of that, isn't there, Anita? In terms of in the developing world where people are don't have access to enough meat and animal products.
The WHO recognized this, and they've come up with a term, first 1,000 days, which starts from conception to the age of 2. And they prioritize making sure that pregnant women and infants do get the right nutrition. And they advocate giving meat to those groups of people because they recognize that it's meat that provides all the right nutrients.
Can you supplement your way to health? Have we basically pushed pills that really haven't proven to be any more beneficial? And we're trying to push the supplements where, in fact, you need nature's food over an industrial supplemental pill.
We would argue that it's much better to get all your nutrients from food. But if people insist on following diets which are deficient in nutrients, then obviously they do have to take supplements. But
are those supplements effective?
And then there's the issue of whether we know about all the nutrients that we need. Every few years, we find new nutrients that we didn't know about. It may be that there are other nutrients in food that we can't even supplement because we don't know about them.
I firmly believe that if you're having to supplement, then that is an admission that the diet is wrong. And rather than supplement, you should be thinking,
exactly,
what's wrong with the diet? And should I actually be changing the diet first, rather than relying on artificial intervention?
And the other thing is that many people who are vegetarian or vegan think they're doing it because it's healthier or more ethical or better for the environment, but none of those points are valid.
Right. The industrialization of farming and the fact that it's the peasants, the prisoners, the slaves, and the soldiers that have been the ones that have done the work to protect the farmlands and produce the farming, which ultimately damages the human brain to create our addictions that make us weak, meek, and followers of the improper directives to a human proper diet.
That's one way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, ultimately, you have to imagine that someone was smart enough to realize that the meat is usually the most expensive, and the hunting grounds are off limits for the peasants, and the meat is consumed by the kings and the queens of the world, which I would say control the message to the masses today. And because we must be careful for our speech, even on social media, because we may get delisted, and that's one of our issues. So I want to talk a little bit about the plant toxins, and I know you talk a little bit about that. We're going to be having Noah Whiteman on soon, but there are many other books that talk about plant poisons. And in reality, is our problem more poisoning and the damage of the fermentation of the sugars and fibers in our gut rather than the lack of a nutrient?
I'd say it's the lack of nutrient more than anything. It is possible to eat some plant foods, but it's essential to have some meat always in your diet.
But then there's the issue, isn't there, of so-called leaky gut? I mean, that's...
So the issues with plant foods are things like phytates, which inhibit the absorption of calcium, gluten, which can cause a leaky gut by its effects on zonulin. There's oxalates. There's all sorts of anti-nutrients in plant foods, protease inhibitors.
I like the word toxins, because when we use the word nutrients, it's assuming we're missing something rather than we may be intoxicated by something. Fermentation makes alcohol in our guts. Is alcohol a nutrient we need?
Unfortunately, no.
Is alcohol good for us in any amounts?
I would say no.
No, but we propagate the use of alcohol because it's kind of accepted around the globe. And rather than speaking against it and realizing, actually, I'm seeing that there's a lower consumption of alcohol in America, and maybe it's happening around the globe. And I'm hoping the words that you're speaking and that we're all doing here are helping people realize that we've been masterfully manipulated to an unhealthy diet under the guise of health.
I mean, there was a time when it was thought that smoking was healthy.
Well, it was sold that way.
Recommended.
It was sold that way. I'm not even sure anyone really thought that. But when profits become the prime directive over really helping people.
In this country, in Britain, during the Industrial Revolution 100 years or so ago, beer was commonly drunk instead of water by the masses because the water supply was so bad. It was unhealthy to drink water. So people drank beer, but it was very weak beer. But that's one of the reasons why in this country we have such a beer culture. And now that's contributing to a lot of issues,
So the civilization brought us all together in a place where sort of we're having a mass party, and obviously we're community in our development. We love to come together, and we love to party, and ultimately we can still have a beautiful life on both animal and some plants. Now, I, as a Mediterranean, consumed meat and plants for years, but got very sick. And it was when I eliminated plants completely, or 99%, did my health really come to fruition and all my diseases went away. Would you comment on carnivore, herbivore, and omnivore obviously we can eat anything. Which is the healthiest, do you think?
I'd say the healthiest diet is a carnivorous diet. I think the amount of plant foods that people can tolerate varies from person to person. For example, people with autoimmune diseases have probably the lowest tolerance to plant foods, and they would do best on a meat-only diet. And there's a different threshold to how much everybody can consume of plant foods. So in some respects, they can be toxic, yes.
So my personal experience is, until about 2 or 3 years ago, I pretty much followed what I thought were the sensible national food guidelines. So I was trying to eat at least 5 a day of fruit and veg, and lots of grains, wholemeal bread, and so on. Then 2 or 3 years ago, Anita persuaded me to try, to start cutting out grains. And so, a typical breakfast for me used to be, a bowl of cereal with loads of berries on top and maybe some yogurt. Typical lunch would be wholemeal bread sandwiches. I've given that up, and I've noticed a huge improvement. I don't think I wasn't greatly overweight, but I have lost 2 inches now around the waist. So I've gone down a size in trousers. I feel much better. My gut health feels much better. A typical breakfast now isn't cereals and berries. It's bacon, sausages, and eggs usually, and maybe some offal, some liver.
I'd say the best diet is one that has only meat and animal fat, but most people would find that difficult to follow. So I'd say do as much of it as you can. And if you have a serious illness, do it 100%.
We understand that people, may choose to not eat meat for religious or reasons, perhaps. Hindus and other people understand, or they, choose a vegetarian diet, including. But it's really important that they do include animal products for health, so eggs and dairy and so on. But people that choose to give up meat, like beef and lamb, and go vegetarian for non-religious reasons, because they believe it's more ethical, that you're killing fewer animals or doing less harm to the environment, I would say that you're completely wrong. Because eggs and dairy are the most intensively farmed livestock products, along with pork. You can occasionally get regeneratively reared and higher welfare eggs and dairy, so it's not impossible, but it's harder to come by. The mass of our production is intensive and involves poor welfare and a lot of environmental damage, not least because poultry and also pigs are based on grain-based diets generally. That's not what those animals would have eaten naturally, but that's the way that we farm them. Otherwise, we'd have to be letting them roam around the woodlands, and that's not very efficient. And it's the grains, it's the growing of the grains that is so destructive environmentally, and also is poor, contributes to health issues in the animals. So
just as grains are bad for animals, they're also bad for us.
Yeah.
They fatten us too.
The animals that graze on the grass would eat the fresh grass, and then eventually eat the flowering grass and eat the seeding grass. So, but they wouldn't eat the grains only all the time. And
no, grass seeds are very small, so the actual quantity of grain that an animal gets when it's grazing is very small. And the hay that, if you make hay for your livestock for winter feed and so on. The hay is just dried grass, so maybe a few seed heads in there, but it's not majority of seed heads. But we do tend to supplement animals in the winter time, particularly with some grain products, because that just speeds up the growth rates and the finishing. It's not the ideal, but I would even say then that so people think that beef is the worst thing. Well, in fact, in terms of the environment and the welfare of the animal, it's the best, along with sheep, because it's mostly pasture reared. Even in conventional systems in this country and elsewhere, any grains that are fed, it's a fairly low level. The levels of agrochemicals that are used are very low. So in fact, it's the best system.
We get this great intersection between the best farming being for beef and lamb, pasture fed, and which also happens to be what we believe is the best diet, a meat and fatty diet.
Did you look at the good and bad bacteria and decide whether or not we're going down the right trail on but you need your good bacteria?
So I assume you're talking about the gut microbiome?
I'm talking about the gut microbiome that we've been propagating as good for us.
Well, I would argue that it's the integrity of the gut barrier that matters more. Most of the studies on the gut microbiome are observational epidemiological type studies. They're not good controlled trials. And if you correct the leaky gut problem, I would argue that the bacteria in your gut don't matter.
Well, they look after themselves.
Yes. How did we survive, hundreds of thousands of years without worrying about our gut bacteria or prebiotics or probiotics?
Mm-hmm.
And there's also an assumption, or I think a myth, that many ordinary people who don't have that medical or scientific background kind of think of us as apes, whereas the gut of a herbivorous ape, like a gorilla or a chimpanzee, which is mainly herbivorous, is very different from the human gut. Wouldn't you say that, Anita?
Yes, yeah.
But structurally, it's very different.
Yeah, so evolutionarily, our gut has changed massively since we split from the chimpanzee line 6 million years ago. Our colons have shrunk and the small intestine has lengthened. And it's the small intestine where we absorb nutrients from animal foods. And that's another pointer to the fact that our physiology has changed to make a carnivorous diet more suited to us.
Are plant oils, that we also call seed oils, are they natural to the human diet? Did we consume any plant oils or seed oils in any significant amount for the first 3.5 million years?
Absolutely not. They're a very new food. It's only in the last 100 years that they've existed. For the previous 300,000 years of Homo sapiens existence, we never ate vegetable seed oils. They're an ultra-processed food. They require huge industrial plants to make them. You can't make them at home. They have the wrong types and amounts of fats, and they're a slow poison, I would say.
Is an avocado a fruit or a fat?
Technically speaking, an avocado is a fruit. But like all fruit and vegetables, I would say limit the amount if you are going to eat them. And as far as the environment goes, definitely don't eat avocados. They're disastrous for the environment.
They rob the people of water for their local survival in order to make a very expensive, fancy, quote, healthy fruit that we've been marketed. Is there such thing as almond milk?
It's marketed as almond milk, but it's not milk, obviously, you know. And again, it's terribly harmful to the environment, much more so than consuming dairy milk. You know, I can obtain dairy milk locally. Most of us can in most parts of the world, with very low food miles and so on. And it's, you know, there are health issues with dairy for some people, which Anita can talk more about that. But in terms of the almond milk, for instance, one of the things is that in Britain, we import quite a lot of almonds, and the rest of Europe also imports a lot of almonds, because they're thought of as, you know, superfood and very valuable in vegan diets and so on, other nuts as well. Most of our almonds come from California. And I'm aware that there are some regenerative almond growers in California and elsewhere. So it's good for them. That's the way to go if you're going to grow almonds. As we discuss in the book, the almond growing in California is just wiping out insect life. So 50 billion honeybees were killed in 2019, and it's similar numbers every year from the pesticides used in growing almonds. And that's just honeybees. It doesn't even touch the number, you know, the vast numbers of native insects that are being wiped out at the same time by these monocultures managed with agrochemicals.
There's a question here on Instagram, Ayoshi. My daughter did a sensitivity test and red meat came up as red. She's very sensitive to it. What do you think of our sensitivity tests? That are they accurate and truthful?
To be honest, I don't know that much about the sensitivity tests, but I'd say it's extremely rare to be sensitive to red meat. For example, if you go into a restaurant, they have allergens listed on the menus nowadays. You never see red meat as one of the allergens. Yes, dairy, gluten, nuts, fish. But I've never seen red meat as being flagged up. I'd say it's. I would question the test, although I don't know the details of it.
Yeah, I've never seen an anaphylactic reaction to ribeye steak ever.
Exactly.
It's extraordinary, Rob, that as Anita has said, you know, all food labeling in the supermarket, and every time you go and eat out in a restaurant, you're given this list of 14 allergens for your safety, and none of them are red meat. And yet, but this is accepted. It's an accepted part of everyday life that these plants or seeds or nuts and so on can have this extraordinary effect on some people, even obviously sometimes unfortunately fatal. But it's accepted. And yet someone talks about a study about red meat being bad, and then that's all over the news. It just does not make sense.
But there are some people who are so sensitive to soya that if they eat pork where the pigs have been fed soya, that can cause a reaction. So it may be the grains, if it's grain-fed meat. I would say if it were pasture-reared meat, it's almost 0% chance of causing a reaction.
Is corn a natural diet for a cow?
No, not at all. Grass and grassland plants are the natural diet of all ruminants. Cattle, sheep, grazing ruminants, goats, so on. And when I say grass or grassland plants, it's not just the grass plant that we think of, you know, with a fine leaf. It includes broad-leafed plants as well that are perennial plants that you would find in natural or semi-natural grassland or in regeneratively farmed grasslands. So and they get a lot of by being able to selectively graze, they can obtain a wide range of nutrients and vitamins and micronutrients and so on.
Cooked meat versus raw meat, and focusing on fatty meat versus lean meat. Chicken, turkey, fish usually is filleted. They remove the skin. There's no bones. And when you even buy beef, they've already cut out tremendous amount of fat, and they're likely raising them for the leanest meat. Any thoughts on that?
As far as nutrition and health go, the fattiest, fatty beef and fatty lamb are the healthiest foods that we should be eating.
And it's delicious. I say, you know, up until 2 or 3 years ago, I would have carefully cut off fat and thrown it away if there was any fat on the meat. Up to a couple of years ago, if I was looking at a meal and I saw fat floating around on the top of the casserole, I'd have scooped it out. And 2 years later, now it's the opposite. When we cook steak, we keep the fat on, or sometimes take it off, but cook it separately and serve it as a side, and it's delicious. It's marvelous.
Sorry.
The other thing that's worth pointing out is that we should be eating nose to tail, not just the meat. We should be eating the organ meats as well. So liver, kidney, bone marrow, or all the other parts of an animal, which are actually the most nutritious parts of the animal, and they're not expensive. So if you ate nose to tail, it would be cheaper than eating a plant-based diet, and you'd get all your nutrition.
Also, in Britain, for instance, during my working life, we have transformed our agriculture, grazing livestock and the beef production. We've had lots of well-known native breeds in Britain, like the Hereford, which is widely used in the States, and all the local native breeds, which were adapted to our environment. They tend to be smaller. They don't reach such a high carcass weight as the European breeds, and also they are fatter. So because of the diet heart hypothesis, making us all afraid of eating animal fat, farmers were encouraged to change over to continental breeds of cattle like the Charolais and the Limousin. And so breeds like the Hereford and the Angus and Lincoln Red are all rare breeds now in this country, which is really sad, because they were producing the kind of fatty meat that we really should be eating. And they were adapted to the kind of pasture that we have. They don't need so much grains to finish. And the other thing that has happened is in our abattoirs and slaughterhouses, they trim off a huge amount of the beef, of the fat from the animal, because the supermarkets demand lean meat. And so a lot of it is just getting maybe not thrown away, but put into pet food or something,
Also, if you want to be in ketosis, you need to eat a large amount of fat, and the best fat to eat is animal fat.
Yeah.
Isn't it true that the majority of minerals, vitamins in every building block of our body are actually in adipose tissue, not in lean muscle meat?
It's in organ meats. Liver, brain, bone marrow have all the nutrients that we need. Yes, and fat does as well. But
I always imagine fat is actually the most powerful organ system of our body. Bears and many other animals will actually hibernate and only lose fat and no muscle mass. It must be the fat that is actually the healthiest. And that's what I've come to believe where this is the part we're actually maligning fat more than anything. And it is the thing to eat. And raw is probably the best.
And look what's happened. We've maligned fat.
Yeah.
As you're well aware, in the last 50 years, the food guidelines in the US and the UK and elsewhere are low-fat guidelines, high-carb guidelines.
And we've become obese and diabetic.
I know it's by association, but look at the levels, the trebling or more of people being overweight or suffering type 2 diabetes. And then people scratch their heads. You sometimes see a newspaper headline that says, is there a link between our consumption of carbs and obesity and type 2 diabetes? And they never really get to the bottom of that. I think they're just afraid. They just cannot believe that carbs are bad and that fat is good. They just can't get over that hurdle.
I always say, isn't it plants that are bad and animals that are good? Because I don't even know what a carbohydrate is.
Exactly.
And that's one of our, we've made scientific snake oil that nobody could figure it out. And we're masterfully manipulated by the scientists and the doctors. And as you've said, that you go to the supermarket and the producers are only providing what the guidelines tell them in order for them to be profitable.
So what most people don't appreciate is that the guidelines are all on completely flawed studies. We cover this really well in the book in a chapter called Science Fiction, which explains in simple terms why the guidelines are wrong. And so why nutrition studies are so flawed, and the guidelines that are based on them, therefore, are flawed too.
Wouldn't it be great, Rob? I mean, if you go into the supermarket now, so the supermarkets and the food producers have followed the guidelines. So now if you go to the healthy shelf of a supermarket, it's the low-fat products. Low-fat this, low-fat that, reduced fat. When in fact, what we should be having is a supermarket shelf of low-carb products, low or zero-carb products. That should be the healthy shelf, not a low-fat.
And you know, perhaps a lot of people don't realize that there's almost no carbohydrate in animal foods apart from some lactose sugars in milk. Animal foods are mainly healthy fats and protein and lots of healthy micronutrients.
Maybe carb-rich foods should come with a health warning like tobacco does.
Well, the glycobiome is the sugar layer on every cell of every single organism. And the glycocalyx is made of sugar. It's the barcode of every cell of every organism. And that's the part that we're not talking about. That's why I think the plants are just poisonous, and they contain chemicals to protect themselves. And we've just been duped. And would you just tell me briefly why sapiens diet and what is a sapiens diet?
The sapiens diet is a diet that's based on animal fat, meat, and offal, and optional, very small amounts of fruit and vegetables. In the strictest form, it's just meat, fat, and offal, and ideally beef and lamb as the sources of meat. But if you can also include eggs and fish and pork, but in its best form, it's beef, lamb, fat, and the offal of those animals.
So it's a type of keto diet. It's a type of carnivore diet. In the book, we compare and contrast how it's the same, how the similarities or the differences between carnivore diet and other keto diets. We called it Sapiens because we wanted to emphasize the fact that we believe this is our ancestral way of eating. It's what led to the development of Homo sapiens with our large brains. And we also wanted to kind of emphasize that, you know, it's not just the dietary side of our evolution, it's the way we obtain that food as sapiens. for most of our evolution, for most of our history, that was obtained through scavenging and hunting, and not through plant-based farming.
So the big difference between the sapiens diet and a carnivore diet is that it has to include some organ meat. And the difference between the sapiens diet and keto diets in general is that the fat has to come from animal fat only.
I imagine there's really only 3 diets. You're either a carnivore, an herbivore, or an omnivore. Mm-hmm. Everything else is a scientific explanation of something that no other organism lives by.
Yeah.
Just because we can eat plant foods doesn't mean they're good for us.
No. They would be a survival technique during our evolution. We have to remember that farming only developed roughly 10,000 years ago. We've been on, our species has been on this planet for around 300,000 years. So, and our ancestral hominins before that. So for most of our evolutionary history, we didn't have access to agricultural produce. So the plant breeding that has produced the kinds of vegetables and fruits and grains and oilseeds that we've got today just didn't exist. So those fruits and other plant foods would have been very fibrous, highly indigestible most of the time, and small. So we wouldn't have been able to gather large quantities of them that would have contributed significantly to our nutrition. Certainly fruit is, might be part of the diet occasionally, but even that wild fruit before agriculture would have been small and less palatable and less available to us.
Are there any civilizations throughout human history that thrived on a plant-only diet?
I don't know of any.
And there are many civilizations that we know that did thrive on an all-animal diet, like
the Inuit, the Maasai.
In general, if you look at nature, would you say that carnivores tend to have larger brains versus an herbivore? Is it a generality that you can spell out?
Yes, carnivorous animals on the whole are smarter than others, like dogs, for example.
Wolves. We
yes.
have kind of one.
Whales.
Yeah. An early pushback I remember having was, well, why aren't all meat eaters intelligent like humans? We mentioned this in the book, that the difference being is that as we split from the chimpanzee line, increased our consumption of meat, our brains grew, became more intelligent, but we also had these things. We had upper limbs that were free with fingers and opposable thumbs, and we could manipulate the world with those. So as well as being intelligent, being able to think of things, we could do it. Mm-hmm. Think of a dog or a cat. They are intelligent. They're very social. They develop lots of social skills for hunting and so on. But they can't build a fire. They can't cut meat. They can't make things. They can't make tools. They can't make weapons. So they rely on fangs and their claws for hunting. But they can't invent fire. They can't invent other ways of living.
Also, they have to eat larger amounts of protein than we do, because they use the protein for gluconeogenesis. That's to produce sugar for their brains, whereas we don't, because we can use ketones as well.
Dr. Kiltz, we have some questions. I know we're at an hour, but I'm hoping we can get a few of these questions
answered. Questions, and then I want to allow the three of you, Dave, Alison, and Anita, to just sort of like summarize, and we'll finish up in a couple of minutes. Is that okay?
Okay, good. I'll pick 3 questions. So I already have this one up from Rockman. Do ruminant animals eat any fruit by choice preference?
No, not that I'm aware of. They mainly eat cellulose-rich vegetative material, so grass or leaves and so on. And because they're ruminants, that's what a ruminant does best. It's the most efficient animal at breaking down cellulose, whereas we can't break down cellulose at all. And horses are less efficient at breaking down cellulose. Apes are less efficient at it. The ruminant is the most adapted to breaking down cellulose, which is the fibrous part of leaves and so on. Yeah.
Well, that's good. That goes right into the next question from Nicholas. Soluble fiber and non-soluble fiber, is that a thing?
Yes. There are different types of fiber, but we don't need any of them.
Industrial products.
One of them slows down transition through the gut, and the other speeds it up. But we don't need either of them.
Okay, great. And I'll take this last question here. Let's say, what is alcohol actually doing to the brain, and can we reverse damage and reverse dementia with a proper human diet?
We can slow down the rate of cognitive impairment. I think there are some studies on ketogenic diets which have shown that if picked up in the early stages, mild cognitive impairment and early dementia can be reversed.
And alcohol is just
a toxin,
a poison that suppresses parts of your brain's activity. One of the things it suppresses is your inhibitions.
Mm-hmm.
Makes us dumber. And it's made in a fermenting gut. Our children are making alcohol in a plant-based diet.
Yeah.
And protein is fermentable also. And I just want to state, I believe that it's fat that is the key for us to eat, not lean meat. And protein, I think we've still misspoken. Protein is not our focus. It's fat and adipose tissue to eat.
And in our sapiens diet, it's a moderate level of protein rather than very high level.
Yes.
So it's high fat and
it's 70% fat. Yeah.
Well, I wonder, because every cell of every organ is made of fat, proteins, and sugars. And so we don't go after protein, sugar, we go after fat. And because in fat is everything we need. And it kills the microbes in our gut also, which is actually good for us. So I just think we still focus too much on protein because it's safe. And rather than it should be fat and adipose tissue, I wonder if that's what most carnivores really go after.
Yes, I
just wonder.
It should be fat that we prioritize, in animal fat that we prioritize in our diets. Yeah, absolutely.
Any last comments?
Our diet is good for people and the planet. I think one of the most important groups of people who should follow this type of diet is women who are planning a family, because as adults, we can choose what we eat, but the fetus and breastfed babies can't. And it's very important that they get the right nutrition.
And can I add that it's really vital that we change this thinking that it's better to grow more crops and plant foods and remove grazing animals, particularly ruminants, because grasslands are massively important. They're one of the most important ecosystems. And what we should be doing is putting grass back where we've got arable cropping. And arable cropping is doing so much harm in terms of destroying our soils, emitting carbon dioxide from the soil and from the fossil fuel use and the agrochemicals, and also just decimating our insect life. There are a number of very good long-term studies now showing an 80% decline in insects, and also massive declines in earthworms. And this is being caused by arable crop production, by the pesticides used. People need to understand that almost all pesticides are used on cropland, not on pasture land for animals. So that's what's causing the environmental harm, not pasture-reared livestock.
So I can't add to what Anita and Alison have just said, but yeah, animal-based eating is good for people and it's good for the planet.
And I really am so grateful to the three of you for sharing your amazing book and putting it out there. It's a great read. I highly recommend it to everyone. And we look forward to listening, learning more from you, and keep sharing. God bless. And thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank
you for having us.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
And a thumbs up and a subscribe would really be appreciated from everyone listening. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.